Before the flames, before the silence, there was Greenwood. In the early years of the 20th century, on the north side of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a remarkable black community rose against the odds of segregation and discrimination. Greenwood was not a place of survival, it was a place of ambition. Known across America as Black Wall Street, it stood as a powerful symbol of black economic independence at a time when opportunity was systematically denied elsewhere. Along its main streets, more than 300 black-owned businesses flourished. Banks provided loans when white institutions refused. Newspapers informed, inspired, and connected the community. Hospitals, hotels, theaters, schools, and churches served not only daily needs, but pride and dignity. Money circulated within Greenwood, strengthening families and building generational wealth. Professionals, entrepreneurs, and workers supported one another, proving that self-sufficiency was not a dream, but a living reality. Greenwood challenged a dangerous idea, the belief that black success had limits. Its prosperity stood as quiet evidence that equality was not a threat to society, but a foundation for it. Every storefront, every headline, every home told a story of resilience and determination in an America that often refused to see it. Yet Greenwood's success also made it vulnerable. In a nation deeply divided by race, black excellence was frequently met with hostility rather than respect. What happened next would not only devastate a community, but become one of the most hidden chapters in American history. If stories like this matter to you, stories that were buried, ignored, or erased, supporting this channel helps bring them to light. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we uncover the untold histories that continue to shape the world we live in today. Greenwood's success did not exist in isolation. It stood within a nation still shaped by segregation, unspoken fears, and unresolved tensions left behind by the First World War, as black communities across the United States sought dignity and opportunity after years of service and sacrifice. Many white Americans struggled with economic uncertainty, social change, and the loss of a familiar racial hierarchy. In this uneasy atmosphere, Greenwood's prosperity became both a symbol of hope for some and a source of resentment for others. Against this fragile backdrop, a single accusation ignited a much larger storm. In late May 1921, a young black man was accused of misconduct toward a young white woman in downtown Tulsa. The claim, never proven and widely believed by historians to be false or exaggerated, spread quickly through local newspapers and word of mouth. In a city already steeped in racial division, rumor moved faster than truth. What might have remained a minor incident elsewhere was transformed into a flashpoint. Charged by prejudice and long-standing hostility. For Greenwood's residents, the accusation felt dangerously familiar. Across the country, similar claims had often led to public punishment without evidence, due process, or restraint. Memories of earlier racial violence were still fresh, and the community understood how easily accusation could become justification. As word spread that the young man might be seized and punished, concern turned into alarm. Black veterans, many of whom had returned from war wearing uniforms and carrying a belief in the rights they had defended abroad, felt compelled to act. Their presence was not an act of aggression, but a statement of self-protection in a world that had repeatedly failed to protect them. Meanwhile, on the other side of Tulsa, the situation took on a different meaning. Newspapers framed the accusation in language that inflamed fear, reinforcing stereotypes that had been used for decades to rationalize exclusion and violence. Crowds gathered, drawn not only by the event itself, but by the larger anxieties of the time. Jobs were scarce, social boundaries were shifting, and the idea of a prosperous black district like Greenwood unsettled those who believed success should follow. Rigid racial lines. As the hours passed, tension tightened like a coiled spring. The presence of armed groups, conflicting rumors, and the absence of calm leadership allowed fear to replace reason. What began as an unverified claim became a symbol onto which broader frustrations were projected. Greenwood was no longer seen simply as a neighborhood. It was recast as a challenge to an unequal order that many were desperate to preserve. This moment marked the turning point where the promise of Greenwood collided with the realities of early 20th century America. The same independence that had allowed the community to thrive now placed it directly in the path of hostility fueled by segregation, misinformation, and post-war uncertainty. The accusation itself was not the true cause of what followed. It was merely the spark that revealed how fragile peace could be when prosperity, prejudice, and power existed side by side. In this way, the story moves from celebration to warning. Greenwood's rise showed what was possible, but the events that followed exposed how quickly progress could be threatened when fear was given more weight than truth. As night fell and tension spilled beyond control, the fragile boundary between rumor and reality collapsed. What had begun as fear-driven unrest now transformed into organized destruction. Moving steadily toward Greenwood, the same streets that once echoed with music, conversation, and commerce were suddenly filled with shouting, smoke, and confusion. As groups of white citizens advanced into the district with clear intent, this was no spontaneous outburst. It unfolded with momentum, direction, and devastating purpose. Homes and businesses that represented years of discipline and sacrifice were entered and emptied. Storefront windows shattered, offices were stripped, and personal belongings were scattered or taken away. Fire followed close behind, turning entire blocks into glowing silhouettes against the night sky. Greenwood's buildings, many made of brick and wood, burned rapidly, and the glow could be seen far beyond the neighborhood, a signal that something irreversible was happening. Residents fled where they could, carrying little more than what they could hold. Families were separated in the chaos, seeking shelter in unfamiliar streets, fields, or nearby buildings. Those who tried to defend their property or protect neighbors were quickly overwhelmed. The balance of power had already shifted, and the community's self-reliance, once its greatest strength, offered little protection against sheer numbers and coordination. As dawn approached, the destruction intensified rather than faded. Fires continued to spread, unchecked and unchallenged, consuming churches, schools, and medical facilities that had once stood as pillars of stability. The economic heart of Greenwood was systematically dismantled, leaving behind charred foundations where banks, hotels, and professional offices had once operated. Smoke darkened the morning sky, settling over the city like a heavy curtain. Among the most disturbing accounts were reports that aircraft circled above the neighborhood. These planes, normally symbols of progress and modernity, were described by witnesses as tools of terror, releasing incendiary devices that accelerated the fires below. While details remain debated, the consistency of survivor testimony reveals how deeply this experience was etched into memory. The idea that destruction could come not only from the ground but from the air reinforced the sense that Greenwood was under siege from all directions. Throughout the ordeal, help was scarce and protection unreliable. Instead of immediate relief, many survivors found themselves displaced and controlled, their movement restricted, their losses unacknowledged. By the time the violence subsided, Greenwood was unrecognizable. More than a neighborhood had been destroyed. An entire way of life had been dismantled in less than a day. The aftermath revealed the true scale of the loss. Streets once lined with opportunity were reduced to ash. Generations of progress vanished overnight, leaving families with no homes, no businesses, and no clear path forward. Yet even in ruin, Greenwood's story did not end there. Beneath the ashes lay memory, resilience, and unanswered questions that would linger for decades. This chapter of the story marks the moment when Greenwood's promise was forcibly interrupted, when prosperity met fear, and when silence began to replace acknowledgement. Understanding what happened during these hours is essential, not only to honor those who lived through it, but to recognize how easily progress can be undone when truth is ignored and power goes unchecked. When the fires finally faded and the smoke began to thin, the scale of what had been lost slowly emerged. What remained of Greenwood was not a damaged neighborhood in need of repair, but a vast landscape of ruin. More than 35 city blocks had been erased, their streets reduced to ash-covered paths where homes, businesses, and institutions had once stood. The physical destruction was immediate and undeniable, yet the human cost was far harder to measure and, for many years, intentionally minimized. Bodies were not carefully counted, and official records offered numbers that failed to reflect the reality described by survivors. Estimates of those who lost their lives range from around 100 to as many as 300 black residents, a gap that speaks less to uncertainty than to neglect. Families searched for missing relatives without clear answers, and many never received confirmation of what had happened to loved ones who simply vanished in the chaos. Graves went unmarked, stories went unrecorded, and silence filled the spaces where truth should have lived. For the living, survival came with its own burden. More than 10,000 people were suddenly without homes, forced to confront the aftermath of destruction with little assistance and even less recognition. Entire families slept in temporary shelters, churches, or makeshift camps, holding on to fragments of normalcy while surrounded by the remains of their former lives. The possessions that carried memory and meaning, photographs, letters, tools of trade, were gone, leaving emotional wounds as deep as the physical ones. Greenwood had been more than a collection of buildings. It was a carefully built ecosystem, where one business supported another and families invested in a shared future. Its destruction meant the collapse of livelihoods for doctors, shop owners, teachers, and laborers alike. Without insurance payouts or compensation, rebuilding was not simply difficult. It was deliberately obstructed. Loss became permanent not because the community lacked determination, but because the system around it offered no path to restoration. As the city moved forward, Greenwood's suffering was pushed aside. Newspapers reduced the devastation to brief mentions, and official narratives avoided confronting the full extent of the tragedy. The underreporting of deaths and displacement was not accidental. It allowed the event to fade from public memory, transforming a large-scale catastrophe into a footnote. This absence of acknowledgement deepened the harm, ensuring that loss was not only experienced but also denied. Yet memory persisted where records failed. Survivors carried their stories across generations, preserving details that never made it into textbooks or archives. They spoke of streets filled with life one day and silence the next, of neighbors who never returned, and of the painful task of rebuilding without justice. These personal accounts stand as vital testimony, challenging the incomplete numbers and reminding us that statistics, however large, can never fully capture human loss. The destruction of Greenwood reshaped lives long after the flames were extinguished. Wealth that might have been passed down was erased, and opportunities that had been carefully cultivated disappeared. The underreported figures tell only part of the story. The deeper truth lies in the enduring impact on families, history, and collective memory. This moment marks a turning point in the narrative, where devastation met denial. Understanding the true scale of the loss is essential, not only to honor those affected, but to recognize how easily history can be distorted when suffering is measured by what is convenient rather than what is true. As Greenwood burned and its residents fled through smoke-filled streets, many looked instinctively toward authority for protection, believing that order would eventually restore safety. Law enforcement officers and National Guard units were visible across Tulsa during those hours. Yet their presence brought little relief to the people whose homes and livelihoods were being destroyed. Instead of acting as a shield, authority often became another force shaping the outcome of the tragedy. For Black residents, trust in protection was fragile but not absent. Greenwood had complied with laws, paid taxes, and contributed to the city's growth. When violence escalated, many believed intervention would come swiftly, stopping destruction before it reached irreversible scale. That expectation, however, collided with a different reality. Officers prioritized control over assistance, focusing their attention not on stopping the spread of destruction, but on managing Greenwood's survivors as a perceived threat. As dawn broke, National Guard units entered the district. Yet their actions reflected the assumptions of the era rather than the needs of the moment. Black residents were rounded up, disarmed, and escorted away from what remained of their neighborhood. Those who had attempted to protect families or property were treated not as citizens in danger, but as individuals requiring restraint. Firearms were confiscated from Greenwood residents, even as the district itself lay unprotected and exposed. Survivors were then moved into makeshift detention centers, including convention halls and fairgrounds. Under armed supervision, entry and exit were controlled, and movement required permission. In the aftermath of devastation, freedom itself became conditional. To leave these centers, Black residents were often required to provide identification or obtain sponsorship from white employers, a process that reinforced dependency at the very moment when independence had already been stripped away. The message was unmistakable. Greenwood was not simply destroyed. Its people were placed under authority that did not view them as victims. This response reshaped the meaning of survival, turning it into an experience defined by surveillance rather than support. While officials later framed these actions as necessary for restoring order, survivors remembered them as extensions of the same imbalance that allowed destruction to unfold unchecked. What made this failure more profound was not only what authorities did, but what they did not do. Fires burned without urgent effort to contain them. Entire blocks collapsed before meaningful intervention arrived. The absence of protection allowed destruction to complete its course, while the focus on control ensured that those most affected had little agency in shaping what came next. In the weeks and months that followed, official silence further compounded the damage. Reports downplayed responsibility, and accountability was avoided. No meaningful justice emerged to address the decisions made during those critical hours. Instead, Greenwood residents were left to rebuild under restrictions, facing zoning changes and rebuilding requirements that made recovery even harder. This chapter of the story reveals how power can influence outcomes not only through action, but through indifference. The failure to protect Greenwood was not a single moment of oversight. It was a pattern rooted in assumptions about whose safety mattered most. By disarming survivors and confining them rather than defending their community, authority reshaped the aftermath as decisively as the destruction itself. Understanding this response is essential to understanding why the loss endured. Greenwood's devastation was not only the result of violence from outside, but also of decisions made by those entrusted with public safety. Their choices helped ensure that the damage would extend far beyond burned buildings, embedding injustice into the recovery and leaving wounds that would remain long after the city moved on. When the fires subsided and the streets of Greenwood fell silent, survival itself took on a new and unsettling meaning. Those who had escaped the destruction did not step into safety or relief. Instead, many were gathered and transported under guard to temporary detention centers, places that were presented as protection but felt more like confinement. Convention halls, fairgrounds, and large public buildings became holding spaces where survivors were separated from what remained of their lives. Inside these centers, freedom was no longer assumed. Women and children were required to carry identification tags, marking them as individuals under supervision rather than citizens recovering from catastrophe. These tags determined where they could move, how long they could stay, and whether they would be allowed to leave at all. In the aftermath of loss, dignity was replaced by regulation, and survival was treated as something that needed to be monitored. Leaving detention was not a simple matter of choice. Many survivors were told they could only exit if a white employer or sponsor vouched for them, a requirement that tied basic freedom to labor and dependency. This process transformed displacement into a system of control, reinforcing the very inequalities Greenwood had worked so hard to overcome. People who had owned businesses, managed property, and supported entire families now had to seek permission to step beyond guarded doors. For families already grieving homes and livelihoods, this added restriction deepened the trauma. Parents struggled to reassure children who could not understand why they were confined after losing everything. Elders who had helped build Greenwood from the ground up found themselves treated as risks rather than as victims. The community that once prided itself on self-reliance was forced into a posture of compliance simply to move forward. What made this experience particularly painful was how it reframed responsibility. Instead of focusing on rebuilding or relief, the system placed scrutiny on those who had suffered the most. Survival was interpreted as potential disorder, and control was prioritized over care. The language of protection masked an underlying assumption that Black residents required supervision even in the face of overwhelming loss. As days turned into weeks, many left detention only to return to a city that offered little support. Their homes were gone, their businesses destroyed, and their paths forward obstructed by new barriers. Insurance claims were denied, aid was limited, and rebuilding efforts were slowed by policies that made recovery difficult. The confinement had ended, but its effects lingered, shaping every step that followed. These experiences were rarely recorded in official histories. While buildings could be counted and streets mapped, the emotional weight of confinement was harder to document. Yet survivors remembered it clearly, passing down stories of guarded exits, numbered tags, and the feeling of being treated as suspects in their own city. These memories became part of Greenwood's legacy, reminding future generations that loss did not end when the fires stopped burning. This chapter reveals how the aftermath of destruction can be as defining as the event itself. By restricting movement and tying freedom to sponsorship, the system transformed recovery into another struggle. Greenwood's people were not only forced to endure devastation, but also to navigate a world that questioned their right to exist freely afterward. Understanding this moment is essential to understanding the full story. The confinement of survivors shows how deeply injustice can reach, extending beyond violence into policy and practice. It underscores how survival was reframed as something to be controlled, and how the cost of Greenwood's destruction was paid not only in loss, but in the erosion of freedom itself. After the smoke cleared and survivors were released from confinement, quieter force began to shape Greenwood's fate. It did not arrive with flames or crowds, yet its impact would last far longer. Silence settled over the city, deliberate and sustained, slowly pushing the massacre out of public view. What had destroyed a thriving community in a matter of hours would be hidden from national memory for generations. In the days that followed, newspapers shifted their focus, headlines moved on, language softened, and responsibility faded into ambiguity. Accounts of the destruction were shortened, reframed, or avoided altogether. Official records emphasized restoration of order rather than the suffering that made such order necessary. With each omission, the truth became harder to trace, and Greenwood's story slipped further into obscurity. Classrooms echoed that absence, history books that documented wars, economic growth, and political change offered no space for Greenwood. Students in Tulsa grew up unaware that their own city had once witnessed such devastation. Survivors watched as their children and grandchildren passed through schools that never acknowledged what their families had endured. The erasure was not accidental. It was reinforced through choices about what was worth remembering and what was easier to forget. This silence carried consequences beyond memory. Without recognition, there could be no accountability. Without acknowledgement, there could be no justice. Claims for compensation were dismissed or delayed until they faded from public attention. The destruction of property, livelihoods, and lives was treated as an unfortunate episode rather than a defining event that demanded redress. Greenwood's losses became invisible, and invisibility made denial easier. For survivors, the lack of public recognition added another layer of pain. They carried stories that few outside their community believed or understood. Speaking about the massacre often met discomfort or disbelief, as though the scale of what happened challenged the image of progress America preferred to project. Silence became a burden passed down alongside memory, shaping how families spoke about the past and how cautiously they trusted institutions. Yet memory did not disappear entirely. It lived in oral histories, in family gatherings, and in fragments of personal testimony. Elders told stories quietly, careful not to attract attention, preserving details that had been excluded from official narratives. These accounts, repeated across decades, became acts of resistance against forgetting. They kept Greenwood alive when written history refused to do so. It would take generations before broader society began to listen. When investigations finally emerged and public discussions reopened, they revealed not only the scale of the massacre, but also the extent of its suppression. The long silence was exposed as a second injustice, one that denied victims the dignity of acknowledgement and delayed conversations about repair and responsibility. This chapter of the story shows how history can be shaped as much by omission as by action. Greenwood was not only destroyed by violence, it was buried by silence. The absence of its story from textbooks and public discourse ensured that loss went unrecognized and lessons went unlearned. Understanding this erasure is essential to understanding the present. When a society chooses not to remember, it also chooses not to heal. Greenwood's buried story reminds us that justice delayed by silence remains justice denied, and that bringing hidden histories into the light is a necessary step toward truth, accountability, and lasting change. The destruction of Greenwood did not end with burned buildings or broken streets. Its deepest impact unfolded quietly over time, shaping lives long after the event itself faded from public view. What was lost in Greenwood was not only property, but possibility. Homes that might have been passed down, businesses that could have grown across generations, and financial stability that once seemed within reach were erased in a single moment. The absence of that wealth echoed through families for decades, widening gaps that are still visible today. Before the destruction, Greenwood represented momentum. It showed how opportunity, when nurtured, could transform a community. Afterward, survivors were forced to begin again with fewer resources, facing barriers that made recovery difficult and advancement even harder. Without compensation or meaningful support, rebuilding became an uphill struggle. The economic setback was not temporary. It reshaped futures, limiting access to education, homeownership, and long-term security for generations that followed. In recent years, the silence surrounding Greenwood has begun to lift. Investigations have brought renewed attention to what happened and how it was hidden. Memorials now stand where streets once burned, offering spaces for reflection and recognition. These efforts do not restore what was lost, but they acknowledge the truth and honor those whose lives were forever changed. Public conversations about reparations have also emerged, challenging the nation to confront not only the event itself, but the long shadow it cast over economic and social inequality. These debates are not only about the past. They ask how a society measures responsibility and repair, and whether acknowledging harm can lead to meaningful change. Greenwood's story forces a broader reflection on how wealth is built, protected, or destroyed, and how inequality can be reinforced when injustice goes unanswered. The legacy of Greenwood lives on in these questions, reminding us that history is not distant. It is present in structures, opportunities, and outcomes. Remembering Greenwood is an act of responsibility. It connects individual stories of loss to larger patterns that shape America today. By understanding how prosperity was interrupted and how silence delayed justice, we gain clearer insight into why inequality persists and why recognition matters. Greenwood's history challenges us to listen, to learn, and to ensure that truth is not buried again. Thank you for spending this time with this story and for listening to a history that was hidden for far too long. If you believe these stories deserve to be told and remembered, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these voices alive and ensures that important histories continue to be shared with the world.